Thank you very much. I'd just like to start by thanking the organisers tonight very much for inviting me along and giving me the chance to participate in this interesting seminar and to talk a bit about the situation of women's rights in Iran. I sat down last Sunday to start to write my talk tonight, having been rather delayed in getting around to it. And I cleared a space for myself. It's sometimes hard to do that at work. And I logged on to my workspace remotely at home. And just to put off that final minute a little bit more, when I actually had to commit thought to paper, I decided I'd just look at my emails. And I did so. And as I did so, an email came in to say that over 30 women's rights activists had been arrested in Tehran. They had been arrested while protesting outside the Revolutionary Court in Tehran about the trial of 5 other women activists who were on trial in connection with a demonstration that had taken place in June last year, which was in demanding an end to legalised discrimination against women in Iran. And the women who were protesting outside were all arrested, and 4 of the 5 women on trial that day were also arrested when they came out of the courtroom. And of course, when I saw that, I forgot about writing the speech, and I started trying to find out about who had been arrested and all the details. It was Sunday, so there wasn't that much that I could do except to try and mobilise our network of activists who are prepared to send appeals outside office hours, to try and get them to write appeals to the Iranian authorities demanding the release of these women who were arrested while peacefully exercising their right to demand their equal rights in Iran. And time was slipping by, so when I came down a couple of days later to sit down and I really have to write my speech for tonight and what am I going to say, I thought about everything that had happened over the last few days, and I realised in fact the case of these women is very intimately connected with the whole issues of women's rights in Iran, and as such I really wanted to use their case to illustrate the points that I wanted to talk about today. Women in Iran face serious and very widespread discrimination in law, and this legal discrimination feeds into an environment of gender inequality which leads to a situation where violence against women is very prevalent. These women were protesting about various aspects of legal discrimination in Iran, which relate to both the penal code and the civil code, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. In the political sphere, women are not allowed to participate fully in political representation. They can stand for seats in the Majlis, Iran's parliament, they can vote, but they are barred from standing from various senior positions in Iran. They're not permitted to stand for the presidency. All the women who put their candidacy forward for the president's elections in 2005 were disqualified from standing via the Council of Guardians, which vets candidates under discriminatory procedures. They're also not permitted to stand for the Council of Guardians, which does that vetting. And in the recent Assembly of Experts elections, which happened in December, the women who'd also put their candidacy forward for that were all excluded as well. In the current Majlis, there are only 12 women members of Parliament. There have been more in the previous Majlis, whose term had ended in 2004. But a lot of those candidates have been excluded in the 2004 elections by the Council of Guardians in an attempt to make the Majlis more conservative. And those women that are currently in the Majlis are of a rather conservative bent, and the kinds of bills that were being put forward by the women members of Parliament in the 6th Majlis has certainly not been put forward in the current Majlis. In the penal code, there are a number of provisions which are very discriminatory against women. For example, the age of majority in Iran is 9 for girls and 15 for boys, which is clearly discriminatory and also opens up girls, very young girls possibly, to the possibility of receiving very harsh punishments like flogging or even a death penalty in principle. where women have caused injury or death to others, the penal code prescribes the payment of DA, and or if women are injured themselves, the payment that is due to them is only half that for men, which is not only discriminatory, but it also impacts more on poor women who are unlikely to be able to raise the amount of DA that they would have to pay in cases where they've caused injury, which may make them more liable to retribution, either by injury or execution in some cases. There are also a number of hudud crimes, which has been referred to before.
I'm so sorry, the people are saying that they can't hear you. If they just hold it, yeah, that would be better.
Okay. There are also a number of hudud crimes in Iran, which affect people there. For example, some of these relate to morality, such as adultery by married people, which is punishable by death, fornication of unmarried people, which is punishable by flogging, or in repeat cases can also lead to the death sentence, and also same-sex sexual activity. And these kinds of moral crimes impact disproportionately on women. For example, women who've been raped may risk being charged with adultery, and this may make them much less likely to actually report a rape to the authorities. And women are more likely to be charged with these kinds of morality crimes. Among women prisoners, there's a much higher proportion of women charged with morality crimes than men. And in 2005, when the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women went to Iran, she found that of 397 women who were in Evin prison at that time, 200 of them were charged with these kinds of morality crimes, and some of them were facing the death penalty. Other kinds of discrimination, the rules of evidence. A woman's weight of testimony in court is only half that of a man's. And in a rape case, for example, women must provide 4 male eyewitnesses, or 3 men and 2 women. And clearly it's very difficult or impossible for women to provide such witnesses. And in addition, women who have killed or injured people in self-defence often find that when their cases come to court, their defences are ignored and they can face very severe penalties. And some of the penalties which are actually prescribed under the law in Iran are also harsher for women than men. A woman who kills her child can face the death penalty for that, but a man or a paternal grandfather who does the same act would not be subject to the death penalty. And a man who finds his wife committing adultery has the right to kill her with impunity, whereas a woman who committed the same act and found her husband committing adultery would either be executed or possibly face a long prison sentence. And in regard to the civil code, there are a number of provisions which are also discriminatory against women. With regard to marriage, the age for marriage for girls is 13 and 15 for boys, and in fact until recently for girls it was 9. But even though it's now 13, girls younger than that can be married with the consent of their fathers, and any woman or girl who wishes to get married in Iran must have the consent of her father. And of course, there are also polygamy laws. Men are permitted to have up to 4 permanent wives or an unspecified number of temporary wives, whereas women are only permitted to have 1 husband. And these kinds of imbalances in gender relations in marriage make domestic violence for women a greater possibility. With relate to divorce, there are also discriminatory access for women in relation to men. Men can divorce their wives at any time, but women, although they can divorce their husbands, can only divorce them under certain specified situations, including disease, abandonment of family life, spousal abuse and battery. Women do not have the same rights to child custody as men. They can have physical custody of their children up to the age of 7, after which it reverts to the husband, although the man has legal custody at all times. And if a woman marries before her children are 7, then her children will go to her husband. And this often means that women are not prepared to leave abusive situations because they fear that they will lose their children, and that's unacceptable to them. Women also have restricted freedom of movement under the civil code. The man is the head of the family in Iran, and he can control his wife's freedom of movement. She must have his written permission to get a passport and to travel abroad. And a man can refuse his wife permission to work. Women have to obey a dress code when they're out in public, and unaccompanied women must have permission from their husbands or local authorities to stay in a hotel. And finally, they're discriminated against under inheritance laws. Daughters only inherit half the share that sons do, and a husband can inherit all the property of his wife if she has no heirs, and a quarter of her property if she does have children, but a wife only inherits a quarter of her husband's property if she's no other heirs, and an eighth if she has children, and they have no right to inherit land. So these are some of the legal inequalities which demonstrators on the 12th of June were protesting against. That demonstration was classed as illegal by the Iranian authorities, despite the fact that under the Iranian constitution, demonstrators are expressly permitted. It states that public gatherings and marches may be freely held, providing arms are not carried, and they're not detrimental to the fundamental principles of Islam. But still, the authorities have prosecuted people who've been organising or taking part in that demonstration. And it's protesting about this violation of the right to hold the demonstration and the causes behind it, which led to the detention of the activists on Sunday. I'd also just like to talk a little bit about the violence in society, which flows to a certain extent from the legal discrimination in Iran. The perception of women means that women in public are often not viewed with respect, and can lead to violence against them, and shame or fear of lack of access to justice can deter women from reporting violence, such as acts of rape. It's difficult for them. And as I said before, women who defend themselves against attack may find their reputation under scrutiny and find that justice is difficult to come by. And there was a case that illustrated this very well earlier this year, and came by a lot of public attention, of a young woman called Nasreen who had killed a young man in March 2005. She had been with her niece, who was even younger at the time, in a secluded area near their home. Her niece had psychological problems, had been sexually abused, and was the only person she would allow to come near her was her aunt Nasreen. And they were surrounded by a group of boys who attacked them and started abusing them. And when Nasreen saw her, Nasreen, who had herself been raped when she was 15, when she saw two boys surrounding her niece, she stabbed one of the boys with a knife and killed him. She was sentenced to death, despite the fact that she was only 17 at the time of her crime, and there's an international prohibition on sentencing child offenders to death. Iran is a party to both the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which expressly forbids the execution of child offenders. But luckily, after international pressure, and her case came before the Supreme Court, the death sentence was overturned and her case was sent back to trial. And her retrial took place in January this year, and her lawyer, Shadi Sad, who is one of those who is still in Evin, most of those arrested on Sunday have been released, but 3 of them are still held, and Shadi Sad is one of them. She gave a very moving address in defence of Nasreen, and she addressed the argument which had been raised in the first trial, that Nasreen could not have been claiming to have been defending her honour when she attacked the boys, because she wasn't a virgin at the time. And I'd just like to quote from what Shadi said. She said, "Nasreen was first brutally raped at the age of 15. That was an extremely painful experience, and according to the medical examiner, the evidence of that rape is still visible on her body. She reported the rape and identified her rapist to the police. However, they ignored it. Given her first experience, she simply does not feel safe to put herself in the hands of men, and she will not allow her niece to have to go through the same experience. If you were to go and visit the place where Nasreen lives, one of the poorest neighbourhoods around Karaj, every time she would go home from running errands or from school, she would have to cross dried fields, the place of her own rape, and with that in mind, she'd begun carrying a knife." Luckily, she was cleared of intentional murder,
by judges who ordered her to pay compensation to the family of the youth she killed. That ruling is being challenged by her lawyers, but in the interim, she was released on bail, which was collected by international donations. But I find it a rather sobering case to think that without the amount of international attention that that young woman received and the help that she got, that she could by now have been executed. The social situation of many women in Iran means that, and the risk that they are of violence in the home, has resulted in a situation where there is quite a big problem of suicide of young women who feel that they don't have any other access, and this often takes the form of women setting fire to themselves. This was a problem that was looked into by the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, who visited Elam province when she was there. And the situation is compounded by women. She said about them that women feel compelled to tolerate violence inflicted not only by husbands but also other family members, for the fear of shame or of being ostracised or of being divorced, and for lack of alternatives to the abusive environment. Things like difficulty in obtaining a divorce, lack of safe shelters for women, lack of legal protection for women victims of violence, the child custody laws that I referred to before, and just the general pervasive gender discrimination, or things that make it very hard for women to find a way out of situations, and they resort to this very sad situation of committing suicide. But not all cases of women setting fire to themselves are actually suicide that women have chosen to do by themselves. There's also a problem of honour killings in some communities in Iran. And some of the cases of women setting fire to themselves are actually cases where women have been forced to set fire to themselves in honour killings by men or other family relatives. There was a report compiled by an Iranian NGO, the Kurdistan Human Rights Organisation, last year, which looked at this issue. But even now, if you check their website, they're reporting on the fact that almost every week there are women in Iran who are resorting to this sad way out for their situation. The arrest of the women on Sunday is also an illustration of how women are affected by the administration of justice in Iran. I mean, for example, there is reports that at least one of those who was arrested, Namazie, had her head beaten against the side of a police van when she was arrested, which resulted in her teeth being broken. And there are reports that she was not permitted access to medical treatment afterwards. Women who participated in the demonstration last year on the 12th of June were also beaten by police when that demonstration was broken up. And exactly a year ago today, there was another demonstration on International Women's Day last year in Tehran, which was also forcibly broken up by police, and a number of women were beaten. And in May last year, 9 of those women lodged a complaint against the security forces with the public prosecutor. And very sad, this complaint has not been addressed in 10 months since then. It's still just lodged in the judicial system with absolutely no action being taken about it. But of course there are a lot of other cases in Iran where women have fared even worse than the demonstrators last Sunday. I'm sure many of you are aware of the case of Zahra Kazemi, who was arrested in 2003 outside Evin prison, and she died 19 days later after she'd been very badly tortured. The authorities eventually admitted that she had died as a result of a blow to the head, and 5 people were arrested, only one of whom was brought to trial, and he was eventually acquitted. The family has appealed to the Supreme Court about that decision, but in January this year, the lawyer for the family in this case said that the Supreme Court, that he'd been told recently by the Supreme Court that they'd been waiting for the file about the case to be sent from the Tehran Public Prosecutor's Office for 18 months, and they've been unsuccessful in obtaining that file from them, which is just an illustration of exactly how difficult it is for women or their relatives in Iran to obtain redress for human rights violations that happen to them. Methods of torture that women are exposed to, similar to men in some cases, beatings and other things, but they're also subjected to rape and other forms of sexual abuse. They can either be threatened with rape as well, sometimes themselves when in detention, but they're also sometimes threatened with rape outside in order to put pressure on their husbands or other family members who've been detained themselves. There's a quote here I'd just like to read you from the wife of an Iranian Azerbaijani prisoner of conscience who was arrested last year. She'd been very active in publicising his case, and she'd been receiving threats from the security services about her activities. And she said, "I keep receiving threatening calls from security agents now and then, ordering me not to talk to anyone, or else I'll be arrested. And the problem is that the dignity of our family can be undermined if I'm arrested. Certain elements of the regime will spread dirty rumours. It's not improbable that certain security agents would dare dishonour our family, and due to such threats my husband is under extreme pressure, and I in my turn fear being kidnapped. I do not leave my house, except on very rare occasions, and only when I am accompanied by my in-laws." And there were other women who were detained themselves in an attempt to force their husbands to do something, either to give themselves up or to make confessions. And there were at least 5 Iranian Ahwazi Arab women who were detained last year between February and April, and we believe that there are still 4 women and 2 children of those detained in those circumstances. One other point to be aware of is that Iran has a very high percentage of ethnic minorities, and women from ethnic minorities do not always speak Persian as their first language and don't always speak Persian very well, and that can also be an issue in their access to justice, because they may not always understand what's going on in the courtroom, even though there is a requirement that translators should be provided when necessary. And there's another case which Amnesty did quite a lot of work on, which again happily had a happy outcome, but which illustrates these kinds of problems that women may have. There was a woman called Hajir Esmail Vand, who was an Iranian Azerbaijani, and she was arrested in 2000 and charged with being accomplice to her husband's murder and with adultery. And she had a court-appointed lawyer, and she didn't understand what was going on very well. And it appears that the judge didn't really understand what she was trying to say about what had happened, which was that, in fact, she hadn't been present at home when the murder happened. She was away with her child getting medical treatment, and that far from committing adultery with the person who killed her husband, she'd actually fought him off when he tried to rape her once. But this was taken as a confession to adultery, and she was sentenced to death, originally by hanging, but it was later changed to stoning, and she was held in prison. In 2004, the arrangements were made for her stoning to take place. There were leaflets inviting people to come and participate in the stoning, but luckily the implementation judge decided there were problems with the case and stopped the execution, and she was returned to prison. Later on, her case was taken up by Iranian activists and lawyers who defended her case and took it to the Supreme Court, who last year rejected the stoning sentence and sent her case back for retrial. And she was eventually acquitted of the charge of adultery, and she's now been released. But again, it's it's very, very close to this woman very nearly lost her life in Iran, largely because she didn't really understand what was going on. These are some of the areas of discrimination and problems that women in Iran face. But despite these very difficult and sometimes perilous situations, and all the very numerous cases of discrimination and abuse which we come across on an almost day-to-day basis, I would like to say that Iranian women are really in the ascendancy in Iran. There are aspects of social change which have happened in recent years which have helped them in their advances. I mean, education has been a focus of the government, and literacy rates of education have risen a lot. It's said to be around 90% for those under 30, and around 65% of all university entrants are women. This even caused some debate in the Parliament recently. There was a suggestion they should be limited to 50%. It was not a good idea to have too many women, which was not very well received. However, women despite being so uneducated, are still only around 14% of the workforce. And in a sense, the arrests last Sunday reflect the growing significance of the women's movement in Iran and what's already been achieved, building on the work of women's rights activists over the years. And many of those detained are in fact prominent activists in one or both of two campaigns which are underway in Iran at the moment to try and change the law in ways that would have quite a significant impact on women's lives in Iran. In August 2006, there was a campaign launched for equality in Iran. A public rally to launch that campaign was broken up, but the campaign managed to get their website up and running. It's a petition that they're trying to get 1 million signatures of Iranians demanding equality for women under the law, an end to discriminatory laws. The women are receiving training, they're going out into the provinces, into the towns, talking to women in their homes, at bus stops, at universities and health centres, wherever they can find them, trying to educate women throughout Iran about their rights and to get them to sign the petition. And when they've collected the 1 million signatures that they're hoping for, which they think might take about 1 or 2 years, they'll be moving on to proposing legislative reform with a view to ending legal discrimination against women. There's a very nice quote from one of the signatories on the website of the campaign, a 76-year-old woman who's talking about her experiences in her family. She said that while my brothers enjoyed happy lives, attending social events and parties, the sisters were each imprisoned by men who demanded cooking, cleaning and childbearing. And when my father passed away, the brothers took the majority of the inheritance. And now it's too late for me, but I'm pleased to know that my signature may pave the future for younger women so that they do not have to suffer as I did. The other campaign that's currently underway was launched in September last year, and it's entitled Stop Stoning Forever. Lawyers and human rights defenders in Iran have undertaken to try and get this removed as a provision on the statute books and to try to end the punishment of sexual immorality crimes. Stoning is a particular provision that only applies to people convicted of adultery, that's married people who are convicted of adultery, but it does disproportionately act on women because of the rules of testimony, the polygamy laws and the rape laws. And although in December 2002 the head of the judiciary had announced that there was a moratorium in place on the use of stoning, in fact, because it's still on the statute books, judges have continued to pass stoning since that time. And last year there was a report in May that a woman and a man were stoned to death in Mashhad. The authorities later denied this, but the campaign organisers say they've got conclusive evidence that it did in fact take place. And as long as stoning does remain on the statute books, there's clearly a risk that anyone may be, or someone who's convicted of that crime may be sentenced to death. The people who've been active in these campaigns have faced quite a lot of harassment from the authorities. Both campaigns have had access to their websites blocked from inside Iran so that Iranians can't gain access to information about the campaigns. The activists have been harassed and threatened and summoned for interrogations. Some are subject to travel bans, they can't leave the country, and efforts to gain permits for various events connected to both campaigns are being denied by the authorities. But nonetheless, these activists have refused to be deterred from their activities, and like women who are facing similar very difficult situations in different countries across the world, they continue to go about demanding their rights in a very active and creative way. And I find it very inspiring to watch the development of these campaigns and the development of the women's movement. And as an organisation, Amnesty International is very proud to support them and to support all the efforts of Iranian women to stand up and demand their rights for themselves. And I'd just like to end with a quote today that Amnesty put out. It's a joint statement between Shirin Ebadi, who was the Nobel Peace Prize laureate in 2003, and Irene Khan, who's our Secretary General. Amnesty International also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977. so it was a joint Nobel Peace Prize initiative. And they said, as Nobel Peace Prize laureates, we know that there's a direct relationship between peace, justice, and respect for human rights. As long as women are denied human rights anywhere in the world, there can be no justice and no peace. Recognising women's equal rights, therefore, is an essential requirement for the creation of strong, sustainable and stable societies, and ensuring that women enjoy equality with men in all areas of life is a key step to making human rights a universal reality. Thank you.